The afternoon that would later be remembered as the day little Brincombe lost its innocence began with the sort of golden September weather that makes the English countryside seem like a watercolor painting come to life. Old Orchard House had opened its gates for the annual Apple Day Fête, an event that Mr. Alistair Cottam had instituted with the enthusiasm of a man who enjoyed being at the center of village life. The orchard stretched in gentle waves beyond the striped marquees, its ancient trees heavy with fruit and dappled in that particular light that photographers spend lifetimes trying to capture. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a canvas awning, a plate of seed cake balanced on her knee and her knitting bag at her feet, though her needles remained still. She had come over from St. Mary Mead at the invitation of Mrs. Margaret Pallister, the vicar's energetic wife, ostensibly to judge the jam competition, a responsibility Miss Marple accepted with appropriate gravity, but truly to observe what could be observed. Village fete, she had long ago discovered, were theatres where human nature performed without the usual constraints of drawing-room manners. Mr. Cottam himself moved through his guests with the confidence of a man who had recently acquired both property and position in the community. At 58, he possessed the kind of distinguished silver hair and well-tailored appearance that suggested success, though those who knew him well might have detected something calculated in his bonhomie. He had purchased Old Orchard House 18 months earlier, along with its considerable grounds, and had since made himself indispensable to various village committees with the sort of generous donations that came with gentle but persistent suggestions about how things should be managed. Near the cider press stood Mrs. Eloise Denning, elegant in pale green, her hand resting with studied casualness on the weathered wood. She had served as Mr. Cottam's housekeeper for the better part of a year, though village speculation suggested her duties extended considerably beyond the management of domestic arrangements. She possessed the kind of quiet beauty that improved with acquaintance and the sort of watchful intelligence that made people feel both comfortable and slightly transparent in her presence. Miss Marple's observant eye noted the way Mrs. Denning's gaze followed Mr. Cottam's progress through the crowd, and how her fingers occasionally tightened on whatever surface they touched when certain subjects arose in conversation. There was, the elderly detective reflected, something of the actress about Mrs. Denning, not in any theatrical sense, but in the way she seemed always to be playing a carefully rehearsed role. The fete proceeded with determined cheerfulness, though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected several interesting undercurrents flowing beneath the surface bonhomie. Dr. Julian Gray, the village physician, had arrived late and, somewhat disheveled, his usual composure replaced by an air of distraction that suggested pressing concerns beyond the social obligations of a country doctor. He stood now in earnest conversation with Colonel Peregrine Vaughan, a solid, dependable man whose military bearing had never quite adapted to civilian life. Lucy Hartley, the young school-teacher staying with her uncle the colonel, supervised the children's games with the kind of patient competence that made her universally beloved by parents and pupils alike. Yet Miss Marple noticed that Miss Hartley's attention occasionally drifted toward the manor house, and that her usual bright smile faltered when she thought herself unobserved. Tom Weaver, the gardener, moved through the festivities with the protective anxiety of a man whose life's work was on public display. His weathered hands bore the inevitable scratches and stains of his profession, and Miss Marple observed that he seemed particularly concerned with a section of the old stone path that wound through the orchard. Stones that appeared to have been recently disturbed and reset with more care than skill. It was during the children's treasure hunt that the afternoon took its fateful turn. Little Tilly Pike, gap-toothed and determined, had been searching among the old stones that marked ancient boundaries and pathways through the orchard. These weathered slabs, some dating back centuries, created a charming rustic pattern among the apple trees, though several showed signs of recent disturbance. Miss Hartley. Tilly's voice carried across the orchard with the piercing clarity that only excited children possess. "I've found something under the stones." The word something traveled through the crowd with the speed of village gossip, drawing people with the irresistible magnetism of potential scandal. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the quiet efficiency of someone whose bones had learned to cooperate despite their years, and moved toward the gathering crowd with the unobtrusive skill of a lifetime observer. Lucy Hartley knelt beside the disturbed stone, her face grave as she examined what Tilly had unearthed. It was an envelope, thick and expensive, yellowed at the edges but remarkably well preserved. The wax seal, though cracked, remained largely intact, and the address was written in a firm, feminine hand. To be opened only if harm should befall me. The date beneath was clear, November of the previous year. The signature that made several people in the crowd draw sharp breaths was equally unmistakable. Clara Cottam. Mr. Cottam's reaction to this discovery was swift and decisive. He pushed through the crowd with uncharacteristic urgency, his usual measured courtesy replaced by something that might have been panic, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "What's this nonsense?" he demanded, though his voice carried less authority than usual. "Some old rubbish that got buried with the garden refuse. Nothing of importance, I'm sure." He reached for the letter with hands that Miss Marple noted trembled slightly, but Lucy Hartley's training as a teacher had given her experience in dealing with grasping hands, and she held the envelope just out of his reach. "It seems to have been placed deliberately," she observed with quiet firmness. "The wax seal, you see, and the careful wrapping. Someone wanted this preserved." "Clara was my daughter," Mr. Cottam said, his voice dropping to something approaching a whisper. "She died last winter. Tragic accident. This is just some old correspondence. Nothing that concerns anyone here." But Miss Marple, watching from her position at the edge of the crowd, observed that Mr. Cottam's explanation satisfied no one, least of all himself. The way he avoided meeting anyone's eyes, the manner in which his hand went instinctively to his jacket pocket as if checking for something that should be there, the slight sheen of perspiration that had appeared on his forehead despite the mild weather. All suggested a man confronting his worst fears made manifest. What followed would be debated in Little Brinkham for years to come. Mr. Cottam, having finally secured the letter and tucked it inside his jacket with hands that shook only slightly, mounted the small platform that had been erected for the afternoon speeches. His color had returned, and with it something of his usual commanding presence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the orchard, "this has been a day of unexpected discoveries, but I prefer to focus on happier revelations." He gestured toward Mrs. Denning, who had moved closer to the platform, her face carefully composed, but her knuckles white where they gripped her handbag. "I had intended to make this announcement in a more private setting," Mr. Cottam continued, "but perhaps there's something fitting about sharing good news in the place that has become so dear to me. Mrs. Denning has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." The applause that followed was polite rather than enthusiastic, though Miss Marple noted that several people exchanged meaningful glances. Mrs. Rudd, the cook, had appeared with a tray of glasses filled with the local cider, and she now offered one to Mr. Cottam with the sort of rigid smile that suggested duty rather than celebration. "To new beginnings," Mr. Cottam declared, raising the glass. "To happiness found in unexpected places, and to the future we build together." He drank deeply, then paused, his expression changing from satisfaction to confusion to something approaching alarm. The glass slipped from his fingers, striking the wooden platform with a sound like a small bell, and Mr. Cottam himself followed, collapsing with the peculiar boneless quality of a man whose strength has suddenly and completely deserted him. Dr. Gray was at his side within moments, his earlier distraction replaced by professional focus. But even from her position several yards away, Miss Marple could see from the doctor's expression that his ministrations would be futile. Mr. Cottam's eyes, wide and staring, reflected the afternoon sky without seeing it, and his chest rose and fell with the irregular rhythm of a man fighting a battle he had already lost. "Poison," Dr. Gray said quietly, though the word carried clearly in the sudden silence. "Something fast-acting, probably in the cider." Miss Marple's gaze moved methodically around the crowd, noting reactions with the practiced eye of someone who understood that in the moments immediately following a shock, people revealed more than they intended. Mrs. Denning stood frozen, her face the color of parchment, one hand pressed to her throat as if she too were struggling to breathe. Tom Weaver had gone very still, his mud-stained hands clenched at his sides. Lucy Hartley had instinctively moved to shield the children from the scene, but her eyes remained fixed on the fallen man with an expression Miss Marple found difficult to interpret. Most interesting of all was the reaction of Mrs. Rudd, who had delivered the fatal glass. The cook's face showed no surprise, only a kind of grim satisfaction, as if she were watching the inevitable conclusion of a story whose ending she had long ago foreseen. As Dr. Gray pronounced Mr. Cottam dead and Inspector Pritchard began the delicate process of securing the scene, Miss Marple noticed something that others had missed. The envelope that had caused such consternation lay on the platform where it had fallen from Mr. Cottam's jacket. The wax seal, already cracked from age, had broken completely, and a corner of the letter within was visible. In the fading afternoon light, Miss Marple could just make out a few words written in the same firm hand that had addressed the envelope. "If you are reading this, then my suspicions about my stepmother were correct, and my father is in terrible danger." The letter that had been buried beneath the orchard stones was not, as Mr. Cottam had claimed, some old correspondence of no importance. It was a warning from beyond the grave, a daughter's final attempt to protect a father who had refused to believe her suspicions about the woman he intended to marry. As the crowd began to disperse under Inspector Pritchard's gentle but firm direction, Miss Marple remained seated in her chair, her knitting needles finally clicking softly as her mind began to work through the implications of what she had witnessed. The Appleday fete had ended in death, but she suspected that the real mystery was only just beginning. Someone in Little Brinkham had committed murder, and they had been clever enough to use the discovery of Clara Cottam's letter as either a convenient distraction or a crucial part of their plan. The question that would occupy Miss Marple's thoughts in the days to come was not who had killed Mr. Cottam. The evidence would eventually point clearly enough in that direction. The real puzzle was why the killer had chosen this particular moment, this particular method, and this particular audience for their deadly performance. As the golden afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple gathered her things and prepared to return to St. Mary Mead, but her mind remained in the orchard, turning over the events she had witnessed with the methodical patience of someone who understood that in matters of murder, the most obvious answer was rarely the complete truth. By morning, Little Brinkham had transformed shock into certainty with the efficiency that only village communities possess. In the grocer's shop, Mrs. Pike declared it was obviously the cider. At the post office, Mr. Finch insisted the letter held the key. While at the Lamb and Flag, the consensus settled firmly on that housekeeper woman. The tragedy had become public property, dissected and reconstructed according to each person's particular prejudices and the delicious thrill of being close to genuine scandal. Miss Marple, who had accepted Mrs. Pallister's invitation to remain at the vicarage rather than attempt the evening journey to St. Mary Mead, found herself in the advantageous position of unofficial observer. From her window overlooking the village green, she watched as curtains twitched with unusual frequency. The neighbors lingered longer than necessary at garden gates, their conversations punctuated by meaningful glances toward Old Orchard House. Inspector Pritchard arrived at the vicarage just as the breakfast dishes were being cleared, his usually immaculate uniform showing signs of a sleepless night. Mrs. Pallister immediately pressed tea and fresh scones upon him, and he accepted both with the weary gratitude of a man who had forgotten such simple comforts existed. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, became the recipient of his professional courtesy and his obvious need to organize his thoughts aloud. The preliminary examination had confirmed Dr. Gray's assessment of cyanide poisoning administered through the fatal glass of cider. What troubled the inspector most was the question of opportunity and the mysterious disappearance of Clara Cottam's letter. He had searched Mr. Cottam's pockets thoroughly after the collapse, but the envelope that had caused such consternation was nowhere to be found. Either the dying man had managed to dispose of it in his final moments, or someone had removed it while attention focused on Dr. Gray's futile resuscitation attempts. Mrs. Rudd, the cook, had been questioned extensively about the cider service. She maintained she had prepared the tray at Mrs. Denning's suggestion, filling several glasses without knowing which Mr. Cottam would select. The tray had sat unattended for several minutes while she returned to the kitchen, providing ample opportunity for tampering. Her responses, Inspector Pritchard noted, carried an undertone of grim satisfaction that he found distinctly unsettling. Tom Weaver had been equally unhelpful, though in a different way. The gardener's nervousness seemed genuine enough, but he kept touching his jacket pocket as if checking for something that shouldn't be there. When questioned about the disturbed stones where the letter was found, he admitted to recent maintenance work but claimed no knowledge of what lay beneath. His obvious anxiety suggested secrets, though whether they related to murder remained unclear. Mrs. Denning had received the inspector in Old Orchard House's morning room, which smelled of apples and furniture polish. She answered questions in gentle, measured tones, explaining that she had accepted Mr. Cottam's proposal only recently, and that Clara had indeed expressed concerns about arrangements, household management, she claimed, nothing more serious. She had sipped cider herself during the toast, though from a different glass, and professed complete ignorance about Clara's reference to a stepmother in the letter. Lucy Hartley's statement proved particularly interesting. The young schoolteacher had known Clara well and admitted to witnessing heated discussions between the girl and Mrs. Denning during the final months before Clara's winter accident. She had observed Mr. Cottam's reaction to the letter's discovery with professional attention to detail, noting his obvious distress and the tremor in his hands. Most significantly, she had noticed a faint smear of blue chalk along the letter's fold, the sort that inevitably transfers from schoolroom fingers to paper. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she absorbed these details, her mind already beginning to sort through implications. The missing letter suggested contents significant enough to warrant considerable risk. The timing of the murder, immediately following both the letter's discovery and the engagement announcement, could hardly be coincidental. Yet the method chosen seemed almost deliberately complicated, requiring quick thinking and decisive action while surrounded by potential witnesses. As Inspector Pritchard took his leave, promising additional interviews throughout the day, Miss Marple found herself considering the various reactions she had observed during those crucial moments after the letter's discovery. Fear, certainly, but also resignation, satisfaction, and something that might have been relief. The residents of Little Brinkham were harboring secrets, and one of those secrets had proven deadly enough to kill for. The village settled into an uneasy routine as the investigation continued, but Miss Marple remained thoughtful, her experienced mind working through the puzzle of personalities and motives that would eventually reveal which of her fellow fete attendees had committed murder beneath the apple trees of Old Orchard House. By mid-morning, the orchard path wore a trampled look, like a carpet after a party, and Little Brinkham wore its mourning as villages often do, in talk. Miss Marple, neat in, grey and quite unremarkable to the unobservant, took the longer way to the post office so that she might pass 3 hedges and 4 gates where news tended naturally to collect. Mrs. Pike waved a damp hand from her front step and confided that the housekeeper had the look of a woman who had got what she wanted and then found it disagreed with her. Mr. Finch, behind the post office hatch, lowered his voice to say there had been a registered packet addressed to Mr. Cottam last week. Signed for by Mrs. Denning, though of course that might be merely domestic business of no consequence. At the school railings, a small deputation of mothers declared that if poison could be slipped into cider at a fete, children ought to have milk at all times and perhaps not attend village gatherings at all. Miss Marple agreed amiably to the milk and said nothing about fetes, which in her experience were less dangerous than kitchens on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. She had a small errand at the school, or so she explained, and Lucy Hartley received her with tired brightness that did not entirely deceive. The classroom smelt of chalk and apples, a combination Miss Marple always associated with beginnings rather than endings. She admired a painstaking map of Britain, praised Tilly Pike's careful lettering, and then, as if suddenly remembering, inquired whether blue chalk still came off on everything it touched. Lucy looked at her hands, turned them palm up, and confessed that in yesterday's excitement she had touched the envelope, only to steady it when Mr. Cottam reached for it so urgently. She had not opened it, nor folded anything, and the smear Inspector Pritchard had mentioned must have come from the briefest contact. That was reasonable, Miss Marple agreed, though her gaze rested thoughtfully on the tidy pile of exercise books, each tied with blue thread, an old-fashioned touch for such a young woman. "You knew Clara well," Miss Marple observed, and Lucy's answer came with a strain that suggested careful consideration of each word. Clara had been clever, quick to indignation, and unpracticed in the slow compromises adults call keeping the peace. There had been quarrels with Mrs. Denning, yes, though Lucy hesitated to name their exact subject. "Money," she said at last, colour rising slightly, for the word always sounds vulgar when spoken aloud in polite company. Clara believed funds were being redirected, that things which ought to have been hers by her mother's will were being diverted into household accounts and improvements at Old Orchard House. Outside, children's voices released them both from further confidences, and Miss Marple walked on to the orchard by the back lane where nettles brushed her skirt and the blackberries were already past their best. Tom Weaver was there, hat in hand, peering at the disturbed stones as though they might speak if he stood still long enough. He started when she greeted him, then relaxed into the shy respect countryman, reserved for elderly ladies who know the proper names of plants. "Drainage work, ma'am," he said before being asked, because confessions often begin too eagerly. Mr. Cottam had ordered him to lift and level the stones a fortnight ago, and then again 3 days since, the master fretting about dampness affecting the apple roots, though any gardener knew fruit trees preferred their feet slightly wet. Tom had found something unexpected during his work. Not drainage pipes, but a small tobacco tin, empty of tobacco but carrying a sweet chemical scent that made him close it quickly and hand it directly to Mr. Cottam. The master had dismissed him for the day with instructions to keep quiet about work he didn't understand. Tom's weathered hand went to his pocket and produced, after visible struggle with his conscience, a flake of blue wax he had prized from between 2 stones that morning. "Like sealing wax," he said, "only not the ordinary parish kind." Miss Marple examined the fragment carefully, thinking of the cracked seal on Clara's letter and the way the envelope had appeared, dusty at the edges but clean in the middle, like something recently lifted and replaced. She thanked Tom and advised him to mention nothing that wasn't specifically asked, which was often the most helpful approach. Walking back toward the village, Miss Marple's mind worked methodically through the morning's discoveries. The blue chalk, the chemical-scented tin, the fragment of unusual wax. Each detail added another piece to a puzzle that was becoming more complex rather than clearer. Someone in Little Brinkham possessed secrets worth killing for, and they had been remarkably thorough in their preparations. Inspector Pritchard arrived at Old Orchard House the following morning with the satisfied air of a man whose investigation was proceeding along predictable lines. Mrs. Denning, he informed Miss Marple over breakfast at the vicarage, remained his primary suspect. The motive was clear enough. Marriage to a wealthy man followed by his convenient death, and Clara's letter warning of a dangerous stepmother only strengthened his case. He planned to conduct a more thorough interview with the housekeeper that afternoon, confident that pressure would produce the confession he expected. Miss Marple listened with polite attention while her knitting needles worked steadily, but something in the inspector's certainty troubled her. In her experience, murders that appeared so obviously solved were often the most deceptive. The theatrical nature of the poisoning, administered publicly during a toast, with dozens of witnesses, seemed oddly brazen for a woman who had supposedly spent months carefully positioning herself for this moment. Dr. Gray's arrival interrupted her reflections. The village physician looked haggard, his usual composure replaced by the haunted expression of a man wrestling with professional guilt. He had come, he explained, to confess a serious oversight that might bear on the investigation. A bottle of dilute hydrocyanic acid had disappeared from his surgery sometime in the past week, a relic of older medical practices that he had negligently failed to dispose of properly. The admission clearly pained him, but Miss Marple sensed there was more troubling the good doctor than simple carelessness. Under gentle questioning, he revealed his lingering doubts about Clara Cottam's death the previous winter. The girl had been an excellent swimmer, familiar with every stream and pond in the district, yet she had somehow fallen through thin ice that she should have recognized as dangerous. More disturbing were the bruises on her wrists that he had noticed during his examination, marks that could have resulted from a struggle rather than Tom Weaver's rescue attempts. What truly haunted Dr. Gray was a conversation he had witnessed between Clara and her father just days before her death. The girl had been agitated, speaking rapidly about her mother's will and inheritance arrangements that didn't match her expectations. She had turned 21 in October and should have received control of a considerable trust fund, along with her mother's jewelry and personal effects. Instead, she found herself facing delays, legal complications, and her father's increasingly sharp dismissals of her concerns. Mrs. Denning's role in these financial matters had been another source of Clara's frustration. For a housekeeper supposedly unfamiliar with the family's circumstances, she had shown remarkable knowledge of the inheritance details and had frequently accompanied Mr. Cottam to meetings with his solicitor. Clara had begun to suspect that funds rightfully hers were being diverted into household improvements and other expenses at Old Orchard House. Miss Marple absorbed these revelations thoughtfully, her needles pausing as she considered their implications. The pattern suggested careful planning over many months, but it also raised questions about the timing and method of Mr. Cottam's murder. If Mrs. Denning had been systematically diverting Clara's inheritance, why risk everything with such a public and dramatic killing? Lucy Hartley's afternoon visit provided another piece of the puzzle. The young schoolteacher mentioned, almost in passing, that she had helped Clara post a registered letter to Bath in late November to a woman Clara called her mother's dearest friend. Clara had been secretive about the letter's contents, but had insisted on registered post and had carefully noted the date and receipt number in a small notebook she always carried. The notebook, Lucy recalled, had disappeared after Clara's death, along with several other personal items that should have been among her effects. At the time, everyone assumed these belongings had been lost in the Mill Pond accident, but now Lucy wondered if they might have been deliberately removed. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself increasingly skeptical of the obvious solution. Mrs. Denning was certainly capable of financial manipulation, and she had both motive and opportunity for murder. Yet the theatrical nature of the crime, the public toast, the dramatic collapse, the convenient disappearance of Clara's letter, suggested someone who wanted the murder to be noticed and investigated, not quietly covered up. The real killer, Miss Marple suspected, was counting on Mrs. Denning's obvious guilt to shield them from scrutiny. Someone in Little Brincombe had been very clever indeed, using the housekeeper's ambiguous position and suspicious behavior as the perfect cover for their own deadly intentions. The question now was which of the other players in this village drama possessed both the cunning and the desperation necessary for such an elaborate deception. Miss Marple had always found kitchens more revealing than drawing rooms, where truth often hid behind politeness like dust beneath antimacassars. Mrs. Rudd's domain at Old Orchard House smelled of yesterday's baking and this morning's anxiety, the copper pots gleaming with the fierce attention of a woman who scrubbed her worries into spotless surfaces. The cook received Miss Marple with the grudging respect reserved for elderly ladies who understood the proper hierarchy of domestic arrangements. "Terrible business," Mrs. Rudd declared, attacking her innocent mixing bowl with unnecessary vigor. "Police tramping through my kitchen with their muddy boots, asking fool questions about poison as if I'd keep arsenic next to the salt cellar." She paused in her assault on crockery to fix Miss Marple with a sharp stare. "Though I'll say this, whoever did for the master knew their way around more than just drawing rooms." Miss Marple accepted the offered chair and a slice of seed cake that tasted of butter and carefully guarded secrets. Her gentle questions about the fatal cider service drew increasingly detailed responses from Mrs. Rudd, who seemed relieved to speak with someone who understood the complexities of managing refreshments for village gatherings. The cook had prepared 14 glasses in total, arranged in neat rows on her best silver tray, with specific instructions from Mrs. Denning to reserve the front right position for Mr. Cottam himself. What troubled Mrs. Rudd most was the brief period when she had left the tray unattended in the marquee while fetching additional napkins from the kitchen. "Marquee full of people with reaching hands," she muttered darkly. "Anyone could have tampered with anything." More puzzling were the 2 glasses she had discovered that morning, set apart from the others on her draining board, their surfaces bearing a faint, chalky residue that hadn't been there when she washed them the previous evening. Miss Marple examined the glasses with polite interest, noting that the residue possessed an unusual blue tint, quite different from ordinary chalk dust. When she mentioned this observation, Mrs. Rudd's expression grew thoughtful. Clara had often helped with kitchen tasks during her final months, the cook revealed, and had shown particular interest in the old still room where previous generations had prepared household medicines and preservatives. The girl had asked numerous questions about chemical preparations and had borrowed several of the ancient recipe books that detailed traditional methods for preserving foods and treating ailments. The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Vaughan's arrival, his military bearing unchanged despite civilian dress and the walking stick that proclaimed his war wounds. He greeted Miss Marple with courteous efficiency, and Mrs. Rudd with the sort of respectful nod that acknowledged her position without presuming familiarity. His business, he explained, concerned the legal arrangements surrounding Mr. Cottam's estate and the immediate practical matters that death inevitably created. Walking with the colonel toward the village, Miss Marple noted the dispatch case on his motor's back seat, its leather worn smooth by years of careful use. Beside it lay a stick of blue sealing wax, its end freshly broken and bearing traces of soot that suggested recent use over a candle flame. When she commented on the old-fashioned elegance of sealed correspondence, Colonel Vaughan smiled with genuine pleasure. "Ridiculous habit in modern times," he admitted, "but one maintains certain standards. Lucy borrowed the wax just last week for her school certificates. Children do love ceremony and official seals." His expression grew more serious as he continued. "I introduced Cottam to my solicitors in Bath, reliable firm with experience in complex estate matters. If there were adjustments to Clara's inheritance expectations, they were entirely legal, though perhaps not entirely wise." Lucy Hartley herself appeared at the colonel's gate, her usual bright composure dimmed by obvious fatigue and something that might have been guilt. She had been hoping to encounter Miss Marple, she explained, because young Tillypike had made another discovery that seemed to require adult interpretation. The child had found what she proudly called a special marble near the cider press, though examination revealed it to be a ground glass stopper from a small bottle, its surface still bearing traces of a sweet, chemical scent that belonged neither to apples nor to any ordinary household substance. Miss Marple turned the stopper thoughtfully between her fingers, noting its perfect fit for the sort of small bottles used by photographers and amateur chemists. The residual odor was familiar, yet elusive, reminiscent of the developing solutions that the vicar's nephew had used for his photographic experiments the previous summer. When she mentioned this association, Lucy's face grew pale with sudden understanding. Clara had indeed been interested in photography, the school teacher revealed, and had corresponded with her mother's friend in Bath about modern techniques and chemical processes. The friend was apparently something of an expert in the newer methods of image development, and had sent Clara several packages of supplies and instruction manuals. More significantly, Clara had confided her growing suspicions about financial irregularities to this same friend, seeking advice about legal remedies and proper documentation of her concerns. As they parted company, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries with growing unease. The physical evidence suggested careful preparation and intimate knowledge of both household routines and chemical processes. The blue-tinted residue, the ground glass stopper, the convenient timing of various interruptions and discoveries, all pointed to someone who had orchestrated events with remarkable precision while ensuring that suspicion fell elsewhere. Most disturbing was the realization that Clara's letter had been planted rather than discovered. Someone had carefully staged its emergence at precisely the moment when it would cause maximum disruption and provide perfect cover for murder. The killer had counted on the obvious guilt of others to shield their own desperate motives, but they had been perhaps too clever in their manipulations, leaving traces that only the most observant eye would notice. Walking back through the village lanes, Miss Marple's needles clicked with the steady rhythm of organized thought. Little Brincombe harbored a murderer of unusual cunning, someone who understood that the most effective deceptions were built upon foundations of apparent truth and who possessed both the knowledge and the desperation necessary for such elaborate planning. By early afternoon, the village had settled into that deceptive quiet that comes after a flurry, like a pond smoothing over where a stone has sunk. Miss Marple, who knew the difference between quiet and peace, walked the boundary path behind Old Orchard House with her parasol tapping politely at thistles. The stones where Tilly had found the letter showed fresh disturbance from the constable's examination, their edges bearing new scuffs that no gardener would have left. In a crease of soil, a dark blue crumb clung stubbornly, waxy to the touch and foreign to country earth. She found Tom Weaver in the potting shed, cleaning secateurs that gleamed from previous attention. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he worked, and the fear in his eyes spoke of secrets poorly kept. Under Miss Marple's gentle questioning, he admitted that Mr. Cottam had forbidden anyone from approaching those particular stones for a week before Apple Day, claiming concerns about ground settlement that made little horticultural sense. "But ground doesn't settle by being stared at," Tom muttered, his loyalty to truth overcoming his discretion. More significantly, he had observed both Mrs. Denning and Lucy Hartley near the orchard during evening hours, each carrying hooded lanterns and moving with the careful stealth of people conducting private business. The schoolmistress had appeared on Clara's birthday night in November, he recalled, though he had assumed she was collecting specimens for her pupils. The Morning Post had brought Inspector Pritchard news from Bath that complicated his comfortable theories about Mrs. Denning's guilt. Mrs. Margaret Ashworth, Clara's correspondent and her late mother's dearest friend, proved to be a retired chemistry teacher with definite opinions about proper investigative procedures. She had indeed received Clara's registered letter, along with subsequent communications that painted a disturbing picture of systematic financial manipulation at Old Orchard House. Most significantly, Clara had documented her suspicions with methodical precision, creating detailed records of questionable expenditures and missing assets. Mrs. Ashworth had provided the girl with instructions for simple chemical tests, knowledge that any intelligent young woman could master. The correspondence revealed Clara's growing fear that someone was intercepting her letters and monitoring her activities, forcing her to communicate through increasingly elaborate precautions. Miss Marple received this information from Inspector Pritchard over afternoon tea at the vicarage, where Mrs. Pallister's anxious hovering suggested that village scandals were proving more complex than anticipated. What troubled Miss Marple most was the theatrical nature of the murder itself. The buried letter, the public toast, the convenient timing of discovery and death. If Mrs. Denning had been successfully embezzling funds for months, why risk exposure with such elaborate staging? Her reflections were interrupted by Lucy Hartley's arrival, the young school teacher carrying a leather satchel that she placed carefully on the table between them. She had been sorting through Clara's effects, she explained, items stored in the school's lost property cupboard and forgotten until recent events prompted thorough searching. Among the usual accumulation of school supplies, she had discovered Clara's private notebook, its pages filled with careful observations about household expenditures and disturbing personal notes about various residents of Old Orchard House. The notebook revealed Clara's methodical investigation of financial irregularities extending back 18 months, each entry dated and cross-referenced with supporting documentation. More alarming were her final entries, marked by increasing urgency and fear. She had discovered that her mother's jewelry, supposedly secured in bank vaults, had been quietly sold through London dealers. The final entry, dated 3 days before her death, contained a chilling observation. "I know who has been stealing from me, but I fear they suspect my knowledge." Miss Marple examined the notebook with careful attention, noting the quality of Clara's observations and the sophisticated nature of her investigation. The girl had possessed both intelligence and determination, qualities that would have made her a formidable opponent for anyone attempting systematic deception. Yet something in the notebook's contents suggested Clara had focused her suspicions too narrowly, perhaps missing the true source of her danger. Lucy revealed that she had consulted Colonel Vaughan about proper procedures for handling potential evidence before approaching the inspector. The colonel had examined the notebook carefully, making several notes in his precise handwriting and cross-referencing Clara's observations with his knowledge of estate management and legal procedures. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the solution lay not in obvious motives surrounding Mrs. Denning, but in subtler currents of deception flowing through Old Orchard House for many months. Someone had orchestrated events with remarkable precision, using the housekeeper's suspicious behavior as perfect camouflage for their own deadly intentions. The blue wax fragment, the chemical expertise, the careful timing of letter and murder all suggested a mind that understood both chemistry and human nature with dangerous sophistication. The real killer had counted on obvious guilt shielding them from scrutiny, but their very cleverness might prove their undoing. The morning brought news that settled over Little Brinkham like fog in a valley, obscuring as much as it revealed. Inspector Pritchard arrived at the vicarage with the satisfied expression of a man whose theories were proving correct, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension that suggested complications beneath his confidence. Mrs. Denning had been observed burning documents in the kitchen grate at Old Orchard House, feeding papers to flames with the methodical attention of someone destroying evidence rather than tidying correspondence. Miss Marple received this intelligence while her knitting needles worked through a particularly complex pattern, one that required careful attention to avoid dropped stitches. In her experience, the most revealing mistakes were often those that appeared insignificant until viewed from the proper perspective. She had been thinking about the curious nature of truth, which revealed itself through what people failed to mention rather than what they proclaimed. Dr. Gray's behavior had grown increasingly erratic since the murder, the inspector reported. The physician had made 3 separate visits to Old Orchard House, ostensibly checking on the staff's health but remaining closeted with Mrs. Denning for periods far exceeding any medical consultation. His repeated offers of information about the missing chemicals struck Pritchard as suspicious rather than helpful, almost as if confessing to carelessness might deflect attention from more serious concerns. Guilt makes people eager to explain, Miss Marple observed mildly, her needles pausing, though not always the guilt one expects. The afternoon brought Lucy Hartley to the vicarage, her usual bright composure dimmed by obvious fatigue and something that might have been guilt. She carried disturbing news about young Tilly Pike, who had developed an unfortunate tendency to discover additional evidence in locations where constables had already conducted thorough searches. The child's latest find was a small brown bottle, empty but retaining that familiar, sweet chemical scent, hidden beneath the wooden platform where Mr. Cottam had delivered his fatal toast. More troubling was Tilly's insistence that she had observed someone placing the bottle there during the confusion following the collapse. When pressed for details, the child's description proved frustratingly vague. Someone wearing dark clothing who moved with purpose rather than panic. Someone who seemed to know exactly where the bottle should be placed for eventual discovery. Miss Marple set down her knitting to examine the bottle Lucy had brought, noting its size and the quality of glass that suggested pharmaceutical rather than household use. "Children see clearly because they expect less," she murmured. "Adults dismiss what doesn't fit their assumptions." Colonel Vaughan's evening call brought revelations that complicated the comfortable theories surrounding Mrs. Denning's guilt. As executor of Clara's estate and a respected member of the community, he had been consulting with family solicitors about the various complications surrounding the inheritance. What he had discovered troubled him considerably, though he remained diplomatically cautious about specific details. The legal situation at Old Orchard House proved far more complex than anyone had realized. Clara's inheritance had indeed been subject to delays and complications, but these appeared to result from legitimate legal procedures rather than deliberate manipulation. More significantly, recent changes to Mr. Cottam's will had actually strengthened Mrs. Denning's position considerably, making her the primary beneficiary rather than merely a dependent employee. "Which raises interesting questions about timing," Miss Marple observed, her fingers returning to their steady rhythm. "Why risk everything with murder when patience would have achieved the same result?" The colonel shifted uncomfortably, his walking stick tapping against the carpet with nervous precision. He mentioned, almost casually, that Lucy had expressed interest in accepting a teaching position in Bath, far from the gossip and suspicions that would inevitably follow little Brincombe's residence. The opportunity had arisen suddenly through connections with Mrs. Ashworth and other educational professionals who appreciated Lucy's qualifications. Miss Marple's needles stilled completely as she absorbed this information. In her experience, people who planned elaborate deceptions often prepared equally elaborate escapes, ensuring that when suspicion finally turned in their direction, they would be safely beyond reach of consequences. As the colonel prepared to leave, he paused at the door with the hesitation of a man wrestling with duty and discretion. "There's something else," he said quietly. Clara's notebook contained references to photographic experiments, chemical processes she had been learning from Mrs. Ashworth. The girl was more knowledgeable about such matters than anyone realized. Walking the colonel to his motor, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. The case was becoming more complex rather than clearer, with motives and opportunities multiplying like shadows at sunset. Someone in Little Brincombe had committed murder with remarkable planning and desperate hope, but the true identity of that person remained hidden behind a carefully constructed web of misdirection and false assumptions. The rain began again as evening settled over the village, washing the streets clean of surface dirt, while deeper stains remained embedded in the very stones of Old Orchard House, where truth waited patiently to be uncovered by those wise enough to look beyond the obvious. The morning brought with it the sort of persistent drizzle that seemed to wash away certainties along with the dust, leaving Little Brincombe looking uncertain and somehow smaller. Miss Marple had awakened with that peculiar clarity that sometimes follows restless nights, when the mind works through problems in sleep and presents solutions that daylight must either confirm or dismiss. She made her way to the vicarage through puddles that reflected the sky's confusion, her umbrella tapping a steady rhythm against the pavement stones. Inspector Pritchard met her with news that would have been satisfying if it hadn't felt so convenient. Mrs. Denning had been burning documents in the kitchen grate, he reported, feeding papers to flames with methodical attention that suggested destruction of evidence rather than ordinary housekeeping. Yet when questioned, her explanation proved disappointingly reasonable. Old household accounts and menus that Mr. Cottam had preferred to see disposed of regularly. She had even produced receipts for new cleaning solutions, their chemical scents perhaps accounting for the mysterious odors others had detected. More intriguing was the discovery that awaited them at the vicarage. Mrs. Pallister met them at the door with a sort of agitated flutter that suggested domestic catastrophe. The study window had been broken during the night, the lock sprung with professional efficiency. Yet nothing of obvious value had been taken. The silver remained untouched, petty cash lay undisturbed beneath the desk blotter. Only Clara's notebook and a sealed envelope addressed to Mrs. Ashworth in Bath had vanished. Miss Marple examined the broken window with careful attention, noting that most of the glass had fallen inward rather than out, and that a faint blue smear marked the inner sill where someone had steadied themselves while climbing through. When Mrs. Pallister moved to clean the mark, Miss Marple gently requested that it remain undisturbed, a suggestion that earned her a sharp look from Inspector Pritchard. The morning's visitors arrived with suspicious promptness. Lucy Hartley appeared first, clutching her shawl and speaking quickly about the need for better security at the school. Miss Marple observed that a frayed blue ribbon protruded from the young woman's coat pocket, hastily tucked away when noticed. Colonel Vaughan followed, his walking stick tapping precisely against the wet stones, and declared the break-in amateurish work. Yet Miss Marple noted a tiny grain of bright blue wax caught in the damp edge of his stick, gleaming like a small accusation. Dr. Gray arrived last, pale and officious, scolding the inspector for inadequate precautions while emanating a faint scent of lavender that couldn't quite mask something sharper beneath. Something that reminded Miss Marple of almond essence added by a careless cook. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the window, and his explanations about the missing chemicals grew increasingly elaborate. The afternoon brought unexpected illumination through correspondence from Mrs. Ashworth in Bath. The retired chemistry teacher had forwarded Clara's letters, a collection that painted a disturbing picture of the girl's final months. Clara had not merely suspected financial irregularities. She had been conducting a methodical investigation, documenting evidence with scientific precision and growing increasingly fearful for her safety. Most revealing was Clara's final letter, written a week before her death. She had been researching chemical compounds, borrowing books on toxicology and photographic processes from the village library. Her plan, as she described it to Mrs. Ashworth, involved synthesizing a substance that would create lasting blue stains when exposed to certain chemicals. Irrefutable proof, she believed, of tampering or deception. She had fashioned a small container for this substance, using a ground glass stopper that would ensure perfect sealing. Miss Marple held the stopper that Tilly Pike had discovered, its faint, sweet scent now explained, its significance suddenly clear. The blue chalk smear on Clara's letter, the blue wax fragment Tom Weaver had found, the blue-tinted residue in Mrs. Rudd's glasses, all pieces of a pattern that revealed not simple greed, but a deadly game of move and counter-move. As evening approached and the various suspects departed with their explanations and alibis, Miss Marple remained in the vicarage study, her knitting needles working steadily while her mind assembled the final pieces of the puzzle. Someone in Little Brinkham had been very clever indeed, turning Clara's own weapon against her and later against her father. The blue evidence that was meant to expose deception had instead become the signature of murder, left behind by someone who understood both chemistry and human nature with dangerous sophistication. The killer had counted on obvious, guilt shielding them from scrutiny, but their very cleverness was becoming their undoing. Tomorrow, Miss Marple reflected, would bring the final confrontation that would reveal which resident of this peaceful village had committed murder beneath the apple trees of Old Orchard House. The morning brought news that should have settled the matter, but instead left Miss Marple with the peculiar dissatisfaction of a puzzle with pieces that fit too neatly. Mrs. Denning had been formally charged with murder, Inspector Pritchard announced over breakfast at the vicarage, his satisfaction evident in every crisp syllable. The evidence was compelling. Traces of hydrocyanic acid found in her quarters, financial documents suggesting desperation and motive enough to satisfy any jury. Yet Miss Marple found herself studying the blue wax fragment she had quietly retained, turning it between her fingers like a rosary bead, while her mind worked through inconsistencies that troubled her more than they should. The village had accepted Mrs. Denning's guilt with the relief of people who preferred their scandals solved rather than prolonged. At the post office, Mrs. Pike declared it had been obvious from the start, while Mr. Finch nodded sagely and mentioned that housekeepers who reached above their station often fell the hardest. The comfortable certainty of their pronouncements only deepened Miss Marple's unease, for in her experience, obvious solutions were often the most deceptive. Lucy Hartley's morning visit brought disturbing news wrapped in the bright efficiency that had made her beloved by parents and pupils alike. The children were asking uncomfortable questions, she explained, and young Tilly Pike had developed an unfortunate fascination with the murder scene, convinced that additional treasures lay buried beneath other stones in the orchard. More troubling was the child's insistence that she had observed someone working among the stones on the morning after the murder, replacing them with the methodical care of someone who knew exactly what they were concealing. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate precision, noting the slight tremor in Lucy's hands as she spoke and the way her gaze avoided direct contact. "Children see without the burden of expectation," she observed mildly. "They remember what adults prefer to forget." The comment drew a sharp glance from Lucy, quickly suppressed, but not before Miss Marple caught the flash of something that might have been panic. Dr. Gray's afternoon call brought additional complications disguised as helpfulness. The physician carried Clara's photographic equipment, items he claimed to have discovered while reorganizing his surgery. Among the bottles and chemical preparations was a container with a ground glass stopper, its contents long evaporated, but its significance unmistakable. Clara had been more accomplished than anyone realized, he explained, creating compounds that would reveal tampering or forgery with scientific precision. Colonel Vaughan arrived as Dr. Gray departed, his military bearing somehow diminished by an underlying nervousness that spoke of secrets poorly kept. He brought official documents requiring signatures, but his conversation drifted repeatedly to Lucy's sudden decision to accept the teaching position in Bath. Rather precipitous, he admitted, considering the term had barely begun, but perhaps understandable given the unpleasant associations that would inevitably linger in Little Brincombe. Miss Marple examined the documents with careful attention, noting the quality of paper and the precision of legal language that suggested expensive preparation. She observed, too, the faint blue smear along the colonel's walking stick, barely visible but unmistakably present, and the way his fingers drummed nervously against his thigh when certain subjects arose in conversation. As evening approached and the various visitors departed with their explanations and evidence, Miss Marple remained in the vicarage study, her knitting laid aside while she arranged the accumulated clues like cards in a complex game of patience. The blue fragments, the chemical residues, the careful timing of discoveries and disappearances all formed a pattern that spoke of meticulous planning and desperate execution. The missing letter from Clara's grave warning, the theatrical nature of the murder during the public toast, the convenient evidence that had appeared and disappeared with suspicious regularity, none of it pointed to simple greed or romantic calculation. Someone in Little Brincombe had been very clever indeed, using Clara's own chemical knowledge against her and later against her father, orchestrating events with remarkable precision while ensuring that suspicion fell elsewhere. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the orchard where moonlight transformed the apple trees into silver sentinels. The killer had counted on obvious guilt shielding them from scrutiny, but their very cleverness was becoming their weakness. They had perhaps been too thorough in their manipulations, creating a pattern that revealed itself to those wise enough to look beyond surface appearances. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation that would expose the truth behind little Brincombe's careful deceptions. Miss Marple had identified the murderer through patient observation and gentle questioning, but proof would require one last delicate maneuver. A trap baited with truth and sprung with the inexorable logic that had made her reputation. The peaceful village harbored a killer of unusual cunning, someone who understood both chemistry and human nature with deadly sophistication, but who had finally revealed themselves through the very cleverness they believed made them invisible. Miss Marple had always found that truth revealed itself most clearly in familiar surroundings, where people felt secure enough to lower their carefully maintained guards. The still room at Old Orchard House provided exactly such an atmosphere, with its flagstone floors worn smooth by generations of careful housekeepers and shelves lined with bottles that caught the afternoon light like amber jewels. She had suggested the gathering with the gentle insistence that made refusal seem churlish, ostensibly to discuss the proper disposal of Clara's effects, but truly to spring the delicate trap she had been preparing with patient calculation. The assembled company arranged themselves with the unconscious hierarchy of village life. Inspector Pritchard occupied the chair nearest the door, his satisfaction with Mrs. Denning's arrest evident in his relaxed posture. Dr. Gray perched nervously on a wooden stool, his hands betraying the tremor that had become increasingly pronounced since the murder. Colonel Vaughan maintained his military bearing despite the walking stick that trembled slightly against the stone floor. Lucy Hartley had arrived precisely on time, her teaching satchel clutched with the sort of careful attention that suggested it contained more than lesson plans. Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, speaking of human nature and the curious ways people reveal themselves under pressure. She produced the blue wax fragment that had troubled her from the beginning, holding it up to catch the slanting sunlight that streamed through the still-room windows. This small piece of evidence, she explained, had been the key to understanding an elaborate deception that had claimed 2 lives and nearly destroyed an innocent woman. Clara Cottam had indeed been conducting chemical experiments, Miss Marple continued, but not merely for photographic purposes, as everyone had assumed. The girl had been creating marking compounds that would reveal tampering or forgery, substances that would leave distinctive blue traces when exposed to certain conditions. Her plan had been to use these compounds to expose financial irregularities, but her weapon had been turned against her by someone who understood both chemistry and the darker aspects of human nature. The blue traces that had appeared throughout the investigation told a story of careful manipulation when properly interpreted. The fragment beneath the orchard stones, the residue in Mrs. Rudd's glasses, the smear on the vicarage windowsill, all had been deliberately placed to create a trail that would lead investigators toward predetermined conclusions while shielding the true killer from suspicion. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Lucy Hartley, whose face had grown pale as her comprehension began to dawn. The young schoolteacher possessed all the necessary qualifications for such an elaborate deception. Chemical knowledge from her education, access to specialized materials through her teaching supplies, and intimate familiarity with both Clara's experiments and the household routines at Old Orchard House. The motive, Miss Marple explained with gentle precision, had been more desperate than simple greed. Lucy had been systematically embezzling funds from the school accounts and the small trust established for village educational improvements, amounts that individually seemed insignificant but collectively represented a considerable sum. Clara's methodical investigation of financial irregularities throughout Little Brincombe had posed a deadly threat to these carefully concealed thefts. More damaging still was Clara's discovery that some of her own inheritance had been diverted through educational charities that existed primarily on paper. Lucy's position as both teacher and secretary to various village committees had given her access to multiple accounts and the knowledge to manipulate them with professional skill. Clara's chemical expertise and determination to expose all forms of financial deception had made her elimination inevitable. Clara's death had been the first murder, disguised as a tragic accident, but actually the result of careful planning. Lucy had lured the girl to the mill pond under the pretense of collecting botanical specimens for her pupils, then struck when Clara threatened immediate exposure of the embezzlement. The bruises Dr. Gray had noticed were indeed evidence of struggle, but not from rescue attempts as everyone had assumed. The elaborate staging of Mr. Cottam's murder had been designed to eliminate the one person who might eventually discover the truth about his daughter's death, while ensuring that Mrs. Denning would bear the guilt. Lucy had planted Clara's letter beneath the orchard stones months after the girl's death, knowing that its discovery would create the perfect moment for public murder disguised as private vengeance. As Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable logic exposed each layer of deception, Lucy Hartley's carefully maintained composure began to crack. Her hands trembled as she reached for her teacup, and the teaching satchel slipped from nerveless fingers, spilling its contents across the still-room floor. Bottles of chemical compounds, fragments of blue wax, and most damning of all, Clara's original notebook, carefully preserved as insurance against future complications. "You see," Miss Marple concluded with infinite sadness, "the blue traces were never meant to expose Mrs. Denning's guilt. They were Clara's own signature, turned against her father by someone who understood her methods but not her heart. A teacher's tragedy, really, using a pupil's discoveries to destroy the very family that trusted her with their most precious secrets." The peaceful village of Little Brincombe had harbored a killer of remarkable cunning, but even the most elaborate deceptions could not withstand the patient observation and gentle persistence of Miss Jane Marple. As Inspector Pritchard moved forward with quiet efficiency, the still room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the old clock and the distant sound of children playing in the orchard, where truth had finally emerged from. Beneath the ancient stones,